Why don't we start with Blair Tremere?
Yes,
Tremere?
Tremere.
Okay, Metropolitan Council, and you're an appointed board member, right?
No, right now I'm on the staff.
Oh, you're staff. Okay, good.
I'm here in two roles. I would have been here anyway at the conference. I've known Randall O'Toole for a long time. I used to work at the legislature last time I met you in the local government area. And in the last year, I've been offered and accepted a position with the Metropolitan Council as the Director of Community Development of all things. What am I doing on the inside of the Metropolitan Regional Government?
Is that here?
It is.
Minneapolis,
I'm sorry,
St.
here
Paul.
in St. Paul. My background is that I come from a local government background. I've been elected, I've been staff, I'm conservative. At current times, as opposed to, I think the last time we met Wendell when he was here, Jesse Ventura is no longer governor.
Which means, of course, that things can get better.
That's right. And for all those that thought he was the answer to everything, he's also the person that brought Ted Mondale as chairman of the Metro Council, brought us light rail, and here we are. Currently, Tim Pawlenty is governor of Minnesota, Republican. And he's appointed Peter Bell, whom you met the other night, the first night. He's the chair, and the structure basically is there's 17 members, 16 members representing districts who are appointed by the governor, and then Peter Bell is the chair appointed by the governor. They are not elected. That is one of the sometimes controversies here in the Twin Cities. The rest is staff appointed by a person called the regional administrator, and this is a bit of a stretch, but if you want to think of the city manager form of government, he'd be the city manager and is in charge of the administrative functions. 10 years ago, just by way of brief history, the Metro Council that existed then was reformed, as they called it, and what Ted Mondale, of all people, who was a senator at that time, and Myron Orfield, whom some of you may have heard of, was a representative. They sponsored legislation that very, I think in a very crafty manner, brought in 2 independent agencies under the umbrella of the Metro Council, thereby empowering it, bringing in a tremendous cash flow, and you know what that means. And it included transit, which was once an independent agency, and waste management or sewage treatment, whatever word you want to give it. It once was known as a Waste Control Commission, and now is an operating agency called Environmental Services of the Metro Council. So the scope of the Metro Council, virtually overnight by one act of the legislature, was broadened tremendously. Somewhat of an irony, when I was in local government, I was somewhat of a vocal adversary of the Metro Council, to say the least, from my little perch out in one of the suburbs, and now I am part of it. And interestingly, the division that I'm the head of now was once the Metro Council, the original Metro Council, the planners, and so on. There's my credentials. I'm asked to speak and influence. How do you influence a regional government? I don't mean this by disclaimer, but across the country there are a variety of forms of regional government, as we know, I think. One of the most common, I think, is Council of Governments, which the Metropolitan Council here is not. And I know that the one in Portland is not. So to the extent that there are varieties, bear with me, because some of the things I say will apply to the Metropolitan Council as I know it. But I think in principle, I've tried to outline some things that will help you deal with regional governments and influencing them. The other thing I'd like to say briefly, and I'll get back to it in a moment, of how to influence, is most of the metropolitan planning organizations and most of the councils of governments are enabled by state legislation. And keep that in mind, because it's not a passing of the buck. What it is to say sometimes you need to know that, because if what you're trying to influence, as Wendell said earlier when he came in, he just assumed influence them out of existence. The people you need to deal with there are legislators. The people that are on the Metro Council or the regional government are not the ones that gave rise to themselves. I suppose you'll find exceptions across the country where there may be some joint powers group or something, but on the whole, they've been enabled somewhere. Some MPOs exist because of just federal regulation requires it, and the locals have come up with one way or another to deal with that. In this case, the Metropolitan Council was created and became a natural to be the MPO. And so there we are. It wasn't that an MPO became the Metropolitan Council. I'm sure it varies across the country. So let me say again, the question today is how do you influence the regional government? I'm taking that to mean, being a former city council person and a former staff person in local government, how do you influence the people that are the regional government? Not worrying for the moment about whether it's good law to put them there and whether they should be there. They are there and they do what they do. I'm going to go down some things that I don't mean this to be Civics 101 or anything of the sort, but there's a couple basics that I've found in my experience are often overlooked by people who are indeed trying to influence legislators, city council members, and in this case, regional government. You need to know who it is. Who is the regional government? Is it a COG, council of governments, or is it a metropolitan council, or where did they come from? Are they appointed or elected? In the Twin Cities here, they're appointed, and that's a sore point with many people because they have some taxing authority, which the legislature gave them. Do they represent districts, or are they at large? In the Twin Cities here, they represent districts. It's a 7-county area, by the way, is our jurisdiction or domain, and there's arguments, I have to say as a side note, that came up the other day in one of the sessions, that the real metro area is about 13 or 15 counties and not just the 7. There indeed has been leapfrogging. Finally, know who the staff is or who the staff members are, especially the key ones, whether it's a community development director or whether it's a regional administrator or whatever their titles. Find out and know who they are. The authorization, how were they enabled? Was it by statute? Was it by regulation? Is it a joint powers agreement? By knowing that, you'll get a good handle on what's driving that body. For most part, providing for local political issues of the moment, most of these organizations are organizations and they do follow their basic tenets and the things that put them in place. They do that. I know sometimes we think that's to the contrary, and maybe local political issues will mask that, but at the end of the day, they justify their existence based on their founding legislation or whatever it is. What do they do? What is their actual role? Some of this sounds very fundamental, but I'm always amazed at how people here in the Twin Cities have been around a long time, including local government officials and, by the way, state legislators, don't have a clue. Partly because they weren't around at the beginning, and therefore they haven't educated themselves. And often what they know is what they know because of what somebody's told them. And there used to be a saying around here with our former governor, who's no longer our governor, was the thing you heard him say was the last thing that went in his ear. So whether that's true or not, unfortunately that is the case though with a lot of folks. Government's very complex, even for the people that are around it a lot, let alone the general public. So you need to know what is the role of the regional government, what are they charged with doing, what is their scope, what is the size of the region. Just briefly, here in the Twin Cities, it's amazing how people will say, I'm from the Twin Cities, and to folks like yourselves that are from out of town, you may think, is that Minneapolis or St. Paul? And the fact is, the person that's saying that to you probably never touches either one of the central cities in their daily life. You can get to the airport without going through either one of those cities. You can go to the Mall of America right over here without going through either one of those cities. You can live totally in the suburbs, and yet you will say, I'm from the Twin Cities. And secondly, you don't necessarily come from one of the 7 counties. And you might be up the road a piece, and if you are, there starts the little rub and the friction about where is the Metropolitan Council region. Do they implement mandated programs, and or do they create programs themselves? One document to look for in that regard, and the Metro Council has one that's called, I have a copy if you want to see it, it's called a framework. and sometimes it's called a blueprint or some such document. It's their constitutional product that they've created that explains how they see their mission. In the Metro Council, we have basic charges of transportation, regional parks and open space, aviation, and waste treatment. And all the rest has been hung on there by the legislature over the years, or the Metro Council itself has evolved some of it because it relates to either one, any of those four systems. But you need to find that out, and usually they declared that in such a document, and you need to get a copy of that. And in this day of the internet, typically those are online or they are public documents that you can get a hold of. They're very instructive because you'll find their staffs often follow those religiously. What is the process? Do they have public meetings? You heard some criticism the other night, and I'm not being defensive about it. You have some that do not televise their meetings. They don't go out of their way to publicize them. I have to say defensively, a little bit in Minnesota, we are very much regulated in that regard, however, and we do notify of public hearings. And I'm not saying that defensively about the Metro Council, but believe me, in Minnesota, it's almost religion that meetings are notified, publicized, and so on, almost to an extreme degree, and we do that. No, we don't televise our meetings. We probably should, and maybe will in the not too distant future. Public hearings, as distinct from public meetings, when in fact we're dealing with policy statements, as we call them, where we're changing the legal documents that drive and guide the development or growth in the region. There are actually public hearings held before the Metro Council adopts them. I suspect there's something comparable in many other regional agencies, and what you need to find out is what does the law require and what does it say about that. Sometimes this is where you find there is a fine line between a regional agency and local government, whereas city councils and county commissions, for instance, might be subject to certain laws that require these things, and the regional agency is not, just by the way it's structured. I've seen that in different forms in different other venues. In the Twin Cities here, we are subject to virtually the same kind of public hearing requirements. I want to make the fine line, though, distinction between public hearings and public meetings. Public hearings is where they let you testify and have input publicly, as opposed to just being there at the meeting. And they aren't necessarily the same. One technique we use is, I suppose you could call it outreach. If we have a system plan, let's say on waste management, it's the plan that's going to guide things for 10 years. We will go out to venues around the 7-county region with well-advertised public hearings to get input. And in the meantime, running parallel to that is an opportunity to submit written input, which a lot of local governments do. Not too many individuals, however. It's usually people with some stake in the specific issue, and then ultimately there's a public hearing before the body itself. Finally, most bodies, and again Minnesota is keen on this with data practices, is there's a public record. Sometimes it's a skimpy record and just touches on the basics of what the action was, and it doesn't have much in terms of the detail verbatim of the meeting. But you should check that out, because sometimes you'll find that there's an extensive public record kept, and then there's a more abbreviated version that's actually published. It's worthy of checking that out. A gentleman yesterday in one of the sessions, his name's escaping me now, talked about mining for data at the federal level for transportation issues. And he talked about sometimes it's a chore. You got to get in there and dig, but the good news is it's public. Lisa Lee was in the same session yesterday, and she was a good example of somebody that's just dug and dug and dug and found great amounts of data about the LRT here in the Twin Cities. And yet she really had to work at it. And but the good news is it's there. So you need to find the miners. Finally, those are the nodes. Know those things. I know they sound very rudimentary and basic, but it's always amazed me how people don't bother to do that. They think they know, but it's very cursory. You need to do some homework on these things. Finally, do communicate with the policymakers. My experience has been personal contact trumps everything, including, and I'm not talking about professional lobbying now. That has its place. But it's amazing how attentive legislators, city council people, and even unelected regional members of the Metro Council can be if they hear from people directly, especially if they're from their district, but just even in general. A personal letter or a face-to-face contact or a phone call. I put email kind of down at the end because there's such high volume of it that often it gets not overlooked and not paid attention to as much as a written letter. Handwritten, particularly, as long as it's legible. Elected officials, and I include in that state legislators, city council members, and so on, very much appreciated. You might be astounded, except for campaigns, how little they get. How little they get. And I'm keeping lobbyists off to the side here. That's their job and that's their profession. I've worked with legislators, and I can't tell you how elated they actually were sometimes to actually get a letter from a constituent. Secondly, if you've got the time and so on where you can interface with them, go see them, contact them, show up at meetings. I know that in our busy lives it's difficult, but the more you can do that, you can influence them that way. They'll listen to you, and I don't mean this in a cheap, pejorative sense. Sometimes, indeed, what they hear is the thing that comes out in the vote. It happens. It's just, I can't tell you that it happens a lot or that's the key, but I've seen it. Finally, be respectful. I know this is what you should have learned in kindergarten type of talk, but it's amazing sometimes if you make assumptions going in the door that the person you're dealing with is the guy you see on TV and the public persona. Sometimes you'd be amazed that on a one-to-one basis they aren't the character that is out there on the TV, and you can actually talk to them. It's a matter of just human respect and dealing with another person, even if you disagree with them. And finally, it was said this morning, and I think it is a key thing, that when you're all done with the conversation or whatever, a thank you doesn't hurt. Also, a follow-up doesn't hurt. Many people don't do that. You've arranged the meeting, you've arranged the communication, is to follow up and say, you know, thank you, and even if you know you disagreed and you're still on a different wavelength with them, they'll remember that. And I'll stop short of the lesson we heard this morning, but what he said this morning was absolutely true. If you want to get political, and I'm not applying this now to regional, God forbid, I'm not applying this to the public officials, but if you're dealing with them in a political environment and they are running for office, that $25 check or whatever, it isn't the amount as much as the fact that you made the contribution. The fact of life is it's recognized and they remember. I don't want to suggest that as a way in the official sense of dealing with your agencies, because you don't need to do that. They're already there, they're working for you, and you should make them feel that way. If you want to deal with the elected politicians that have some real influence, then you need to be at the legislative level, I would maintain. And finally, don't forget the staff, find out who they are, and I would copy them, the materials that Randall has out here and so on. If you're really going to send it to somebody that'll spend some time with it because it's their job, would be the key staff people. If you also have copies of this material and want to send it to the policymakers and so on, that's fine, but some of them get a volume of material like you wouldn't believe from every quarter. The staff, however, is usually a professional staff that's there to know how to sort this stuff out and make use of it. And at the end of the day, the policymakers lean on the staff anyway at the end of the day for their input. That's it.
Well, the interesting thing, by the way, you said, it's a minor issue. Peter Bell the other night, and you have both mentioned that the Met Council jurisdiction is 7 counties. I think Peter said it was a 2.7 million population.
Yes.
The current census definition of the consolidated metropolitan area is 17 counties, 2 of which are in Wisconsin, and a population of 3.3. And I suspect that the collar counties are actually, the outer collar counties are probably growing as fast, if not faster, percentage-wise, than the outer counties within the Met Council.
Right.
Theoretically, I don't know if that's true, but it's...
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, metropolitan regions are just getting bigger and bigger, and especially in a place like here, and especially given your organization in where I live in St. Louis, which is a 2-state metropolitan area with a weak regular standard weak MPO, They've got a bi-state compact, and they have a state. You know, here you could never have that. I mean, the two counties of Wisconsin are probably going to be reluctant to have the governor of Minnesota appointing members to the Metropolitan Council.
I should point out, though, that's an interesting observation. The Peter Bell, the chairman, has made it a point to have the staff and the regional administrator and I have actually been in touch with what we call, our term here is collar counties. The counties that are around the 7 counties, and several of them, 2 and actually 3 are right across the river in Wisconsin. And we've reached out to them to meet with them and discuss with them. Of course, some of these counties get a little nervous when they see us coming because they think we're like Pac-Man, and we got to be careful of that. And the previous Metro councils have tried this at one time or another, and so our approach has been working on a voluntary basis with them, just talk, and most of them have been quite receptive to it because of nothing else. What they're experiencing in reality is a tremendous amount of growth, many of them. And so they're awake to that issue. It can be a very positive experience, but of course, depending philosophically where you're coming from, if you're not a high proponent of regional government, there's the sensitivity of expansion and enlargement that you may not want to pursue. If I could, as a footnote to that issue, is don't forget that often those, at least in our case, we're there because the legislature put us there, and we aren't even able to pull a pin and self-destruct. So it's the legislature that eventually has to come to grips with that issue, and I just want to make that point, that the agencies themselves, I know it's defensive now that I am one, aren't able to just willy-nilly back off and not do anything, especially if they've been given operational functions such as sewage treatment and so on. So it's the legislature at the end of the day that needs to come to grips with that.
And another interesting point, slightly off the subject, about the Twin Cities area, is that, as Peter Bell indicated the other night, they anticipate another 1 million people in the next 25 or 30 years, whatever it is. Minneapolis-St. Paul exhibits the growth trends of the South and the West. There's no other Midwestern metropolitan area that has grown anything like it. Where I live, where Stefan lives, all of the Midwestern urban areas have stopped growing or grown very slowly for whatever reason. And well, and your growth, with all due respect, is in Kentucky, not Ohio, the principal amount of your growth. But it's incredible what I don't know how it is you've done it, but you know, with all due, some of us think of you as having the worst climate in North America, and you nonetheless have grown just like a Sun Belt city. It's unbelievable.